What I'm about to show you could get me killed in 11 countries. In the holiest book of 1.8 billion people, there's a story, 20 verses, Surah 18, verses 83 through 102. Muslims have recited these words for 1,400 years, believing them to be the literal speech of God. But I can prove with documentation you can verify for yourself that every single word of this story was recycled, not inspired, not revealed by God, taken from men, copied line by line from the Syriac Alexander Legend, Neṣḥānā, a political apocalyptic text rooted in mid-6th century focused on Byzantine Syriac Christian concerns. And here's what makes this absolutely devastating. We know exactly which text it came from. We know this text is 50 to 80 years before Muhammad's ministry. We can show you where Muhammad's sources got the story. We can trace it motif by motif, and sometimes even word choice by word choice. The story goes like this. A mysterious hero with 2 horns marches to the western edge of the world where he finds, and I quote the Qur'an, the sun setting in a muddy spring. The sun setting in a pool of water at the edge of the earth. He then travels east to where the sun rises, again, an actual physical location in this ancient cosmology. Finally, he reaches a mountain pass where terrified people beg him to save them from Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic forces of chaos that will destroy the world at the end of days. So this hero performs an engineering miracle. He commands his people to bring blocks of iron, which they pile between the mountain cliffs. Then, bring molten copper to pour over it. The result? An indestructible wall that traps these supernatural beings until God's appointed hour when the world ends. Now here's the question that destroys 13 centuries of Islamic theology. Who is this 2-horned hero? You will know for sure soon. In this video, we are going to show you the exact Christian text from between 530 to 565 CE, written 5 to 40 years before Muhammad was even born. He was born around 570 AD, that contains this entire story, the 2-horned conqueror, the journey to the sunset, the wall against Gog and Magog, even the iron and brass construction method. Same hero, same journey, same wall, same details. We will hear from Dr. Kevin Van Bladel and Dr. Tommaso Tessa E., the world's leading experts on Quranic sources related to this, who call this the only case of a Quranic passage that can be traced back to a specific source contemporary with Muhammad's life. Will systematically demolish every apologetic defense, the "it was Cyrus" theory, the "it's historical" claim, the "Christians copied from the Qur'an" desperation move, the "it's just symbolic" retreat, and will confront the inescapable conclusion: if the Qur'an claimed to be the literal dictation of an omniscient God, had to copy a Christian propaganda text about a pagan Macedonian conqueror to answer a basic question posed by Meccan skeptics? What does that tell you about its true origins? Before we go further, let me be very clear about what we are doing here at MythVision. We are not attacking people. We are examining text. We're following evidence. We're doing the scholarship that religious institutions are too compromised to pursue. Make sure you're subscribed because this is episode 2 of our human origins of the Qur'an. Episode 1 exposed how the 7 sleepers of Ephesus ended up in the Qur'an. We've got dozens more coming. And here's the deal. YouTube makes us walk on eggshells with this content. But by joining our Patreon, we can go deeper and continue this journey. You gain early access to every episode we produce, and you can contact me personally. You're not just getting content, you're funding independent investigation. And when I interview scholars in person, I usually take 1 question per patron for the academics and record the answer in high-quality video. A video all for you. Professor Robert Hoyland will be visiting me in December of this year, so join while you can. Get your question in and make history. Now, let's begin. Let's trace this tale from its birth in Mesopotamia, through Greek legend, reshaped in Christian apocalyptic literature, and finally, into its Quranic form. The story of al-Qarnayn isn't revelation, it's recycled legend. The setting is Mecca, early 7th century of the Common Era. The Prophet Muhammad faces his most public test yet. According to Islamic tradition, Jewish rabbis and pagan skeptics have conspired to challenge his claims of prophethood with 3 impossible questions. They want to know about mysterious sleepers in a cave, about the nature of the soul, and about a legendary king who traveled to the ends of the earth. The Quran preserves their challenge. They ask thee concerning al-Qarnayn, say, I will tell you something of his story. Quran 18:83. This isn't presented as optional knowledge. This is framed as a test of prophetic authority. If Muhammad can recount this tale correctly, it will prove his divine connection. This also gives us the hint of this story having apocalyptic significance during the 6th to 7th centuries CE. So who is this al-Qarnayn? Literally, the one with 2 horns. The Quran never explicitly names him, but the story it tells is unmistakable to anyone familiar with late antique legend. The narrative unfolds in 3 epic journeys. First, al-Qarnayn marches westward, and the Quran describes something that should make every scientifically minded person's jaw drop. Till, when he reached the setting place of the sun, he found it setting in a muddy spring and found a people thereabout. Let that sink in. The sun, that massive ball of nuclear fusion 93 million miles away, sets in a muddy spring at the edge of the earth. This isn't poetic language. This is flat earth cosmology, the kind of mythological geography that was common in ancient folklore, but has no place in a text allegedly dictated by the creator of the universe. This is legendary geography at its finest. Next, al-Qarnayn travels eastward, till when he came to the rising place of the sun, he found it rising on a people for whom we had provided no shelter from it. Again, we're in the realm of legend, a place where the sun physically rises, at a specific location, where people need to hide from its rays as if it's a cosmic spotlight rather than a distant star. But it's the 3rd journey northwards that seals the deal of the story's true origins. al-Qarnayn reaches a place between 2 mountain barriers, where he encounters desperate people who speak in a broken language. They are very hard to understand. They have a terrifying problem. Oh, al-Qarnayn, Gog and Magog are wreaking havoc in our land. Can we pay you tribute so that you will build a barrier between us and them? The story of Gog and Magog, Ya'juj wa Ma'juj, stretches from ancient prophecy to medieval legend. Its earliest mention is in Ezekiel 38 through 39, where Gog of the land of Magog is a distant enemy prince leading nations against Israel. Here, Magog is clearly a land, not a people. Over time, Jewish apocalyptic imagination reshaped the picture. In the book of Jubilees and 1 Enoch, Gog and Magog become hostile nations. And by Josephus in Antiquities, they are explicitly identified with the Scythians. This ethnicizing trend carried into the Sibylline oracles and into the book of Revelation, where Gog and Magog stand for the ultimate apocalyptic hordes unleashed at the end of days. The tradition takes a dramatic turn in the Alexander romance and its later Syriac and Christian legends, where Alexander the Great journeys to the edges of the world and constructs a massive iron gate or wall in the Caucasus to lock away the wild nations of Gog and Magog until the final judgment. This story was wildly popular, retold across Greek, Syriac, Armenian, and Arabic traditions. By the time of the Qur'an, Gog and Magog appear squarely in this Alexander framework. They are chaotic peoples penned in behind al-Qarnayn's barrier, destined to be released only at the appointed hour of God's eschatological plan. What began in Ezekiel as land and ruler became, through centuries of Jewish and Christian reinterpretation, apocalyptic nations. And by the time of the Romance, the very hordes Alexander himself was said to have chained behind the mountains. A vision the Qur'an then absorbed into its own prophetic picture. What follows in the Qur'an is an engineering marvel described in surprising detail. al-Qarnayn commands, "Bring me blocks of iron." The workers pile iron blocks between the mountain cliffs until they fill the gap. Then comes the crucial step: "Bring me molten copper to pour over it." The result? They, Gog and Magog, were unable to scale it, nor could they pierce it. An impenetrable barrier of iron and mass, sealed by divine engineering, holding back the forces of chaos until God's appointed time, when it will crumble and the end will come. al-Qarnayn declares, "This is a mercy from my Lord, but when the promise of my Lord comes, he will level it." The wall becomes a cosmic timer, a physical countdown to Judgment Day. You see, the Quran portrays al-Qarnayn as a just king and pious hero, a world conqueror who punishes the wicked, rewards the righteous, and defends civilization from chaos, all under God's guidance. But notably, the Quran never names this figure explicitly. The same issue happened with the sleepers in the cave story earlier in the same Surah 18. The Quran strips it of Christian details by removing their names. The Emperor Decius in the Christian iconography. It's an epic tale worthy of legend, and that's exactly what it is, because this exact story with these exact details appears in texts that predate Islam by centuries. It's 356 BCE, Macedonia. A child is born who will become the most legendary figure in Western history. Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander the Great, would conquer an empire stretching from Greece to India before dying at the impossibly young age of 32. In less than 10 years, this Macedonian king toppled the Persian Empire, marched into Egypt, where he was crowned pharaoh, crossed into India fighting war elephants, and built the largest empire the world had ever seen. His death came young, possibly from poisoning, possibly from disease, possibly from drinking himself to death, but his legend refused to die. Alexander's achievements made him the yardstick of greatness for all who came after. From Julius Caesar to Napoleon, rulers measured themselves against the boy king of Macedon. That's the power of Alexander's name. Julius Caesar allegedly wept at a statue of Alexander, lamenting that at Alexander's age, Caesar had achieved nothing. Roman emperors for centuries marched eastward, not just for conquest, but to prove they could rival Alexander, to be remembered as the next world conqueror. Many Roman leaders, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, and other successive emperors, used Alexander as a template for imperial ambition. But here's what makes Alexander so crucial to our investigation. His historical empire collapsed almost immediately after his death. His generals carved it up, fought over the pieces, and within a generation, the unity he'd created was shattered. Alexander's empire collapsed, or rather fractured, almost as soon as he died. But his image proved indestructible. He became a conqueror of imagination as much as of territory. Imagination. That's where Alexander truly conquered. Within decades of his death, the legends of Alexander began. And they grew wilder and more fantastical with each passing century. These legends coalesced into what scholars call the Alexander Romance, a collection of fantastical tales that spread across every major language of the ancient world: Greek, Latin, Syriac, Persian, Arabic, Armenian, Ethiopic, and many others. In these legends, Alexander doesn't just conquer Persia, he flies to heaven in a chariot pulled by griffins. He doesn't just march to India. He discovers the fountain of youth and the land of darkness. He doesn't just die young. He becomes immortal in legend, his story retold and reshaped by every culture that encountered it. Greeks made him a hero. Egyptians made him the son of their god, Amun, crowned with ram's horns. Jewish traditions wove him into the Bible's story of world empires. Syriac Christians, and this is crucial, recast him as a pious prophet king, monotheistic figure, a builder of a mighty gate to confine the chaos of Gog and Magog. Paraphrasing Dr. Tommaso Tessai, one of the world's leading experts on the Syriac Alexander Legend, in his 2023 study, get a copy of this book, I swear it's amazing. He says this in the summary: the Syriac Alexander Legend, Syriac Neṣḥānā, shows us how late antique Christians recast Alexander as a prophet king. He is not simply a pagan hero, but an apocalyptic figure, erecting barriers against Gog and Magog in preparation for the end of days. Alexander engraves a prophecy over its gate, predicting the future attacks of Gog and Magog and end-time events. This is critical to understand. By the 6th and 7th century of the Common Era, Alexander wasn't just a historical figure from the past. He was a living symbol, a template for divine kingship, a model for righteous conquest, a hero who had achieved what every empire dreamed of: universal dominion under heaven's mandate. And here's what makes this explosive. This is the Alexander who enters the Qur'an. Not the mere Macedonian conqueror of history, not the actual pagan who claimed to be Zeus Ammon's son, but the sanitized, Christianized, apocalyptic prophet king version, al-Qarnayn, the two-horned one. For the early Muslim community in the 7th century, forging its own path of world conquest, Alexander was the perfect model, a figure who had united nations, subdued enemies, and embodied God's will for the universal dominion. But adopting him into Scripture, the Quran gave its audience a cosmic precedent, the conqueror whose shadow would forever stretch into new empires, new faiths, and new ages. Alexander conquered the world with armies. His memory conquered the world with stories. And in Islam, he became immortal as the two-horned one. But one element of the Alexander legend is crucial to our investigation, and it's about to expose something devastating about the Quran's origins. We need to talk about the horns, the pagan birth of the horns, Zeus Ammon. It's Egypt, 331 BCE. A 25-year-old Macedonian king makes a dangerous pilgrimage across the Libyan desert to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa. Alexander the Great isn't just seeking military advice, he's seeking divine legitimacy. At Siwa, the oracle proclaims what Alexander desperately wants to hear. He is the son of Zeus Ammon, not Philip of Macedonia, but a god. Zeus Ammon was depicted as a ram-headed deity, and from this moment forward, Alexander would be portrayed with two curling ram's horns sprouting from his head. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't metaphorical. The horns were an explicit claim of divinity, that Alexander was literally the son of a pagan god. Coins minted across his empire, statues in conquered cities, mosaics in palaces, all showed Alexander with these ram's horns as proof of his god-man status. In their original context, these horns meant one thing and one thing only: pagan divine sonship. They linked Alexander directly to Zeus Ammon worship, the kind of polytheistic idolatry that the Qur'an explicitly condemns throughout its verses. Jewish apocalyptic reinterpretation. But here's where it gets fascinating and damning for the Qur'an's claims. Centuries after Alexander's death, Jewish apocalyptic writers couldn't ignore his enduring cultural dominance. But they couldn't accept the pagan meaning of his horns either. So they did what religious communities always do with uncomfortable cultural symbols. They reinterpreted them. The book of Daniel, chapter 8, describes a prophetic vision, a ram with two horns representing kings and empires. As expert on Daniel, John J. Collins in his commentary says, Josephus reads many horns, but it is clear from verse 20 that the horns represent Media and Persia, respectively. Hence, the second is longer and arises last. The representation of Media and Persia as two horns of the same kingdom departs from the view of the four kingdoms standard throughout the book, which treats Media separately. Jewish interpreters seized on this. Alexander could become the horned one, no longer the son of Zeus Ammon, but an instrument of biblical prophecy, a figure in God's plan for history. This Danielic picture opened the door for later interpreters to see Alexander in a new light. The pagan horns of divine sonship were being scrubbed clean and repurposed as prophetic symbolism. This is cultural appropriation in action, taking a rival religion's imagery and baptizing it into your own theological framework. This process creates a gap between the original intent and the understanding for later people knowing it through this Jewish filter. Already in the 1st century, Josephus in Antiquities 11, we're told that when Alexander marched toward Jerusalem, the high priest Yaddua went out in full priestly robes to meet him. To everyone's shock, Alexander dismounted and bowed, not to Yaddua, but to the name of the god he represented. He explained that in a dream before his Persian campaign, he had seen this very figure promising him victory. Once in Jerusalem, Alexander entered the temple, offered sacrifice to the God of Israel, and showed profound respect for Jewish worship. He granted the Jews the right to live according to their ancestral laws, and even exempted them from tribute in the sabbatical year. It's a remarkable scene, the world's greatest conqueror humbling himself before Israel's God and honoring the Jewish people's way of life. This tradition planted the seed of a later prophet king of the one true God, Alexander. By late antiquity, Syriac-speaking Christians took this Jewish reinterpretation even further. In texts like the Neṣḥānā de Alexandros, 6th to 7th century CE, Alexander becomes a pious Christian prophet king. As Dr. Tommaso Tessei demonstrates in his research, this was a deliberate theological transformation. The horns that once screamed, Zeus Amen, pagan god worship, divine sonship, were now being presented as signs of divine empowerment, symbols that the one true God had given Alexander to conquer nations, and most importantly, to confine Gog and Magog. In a sense, Alexander's pagan roots get baptized of their icky polytheistic roots. What had been explicitly pagan idolatry was now being packaged as Christian salvation history. The Syriac Christians weren't stupid, but a real question remains and should be asked. Did they know the original meaning of the horns of Alexander? Or did they blindly inherit the sanitized Alexander from the Jews? Either way, they were rewriting the story for their own theological purposes. In fact, the horns of Alexander are described twice in the Syriac Alexander Legend. The first is during a prayer by Alexander's. King Alexander bowed and worshiping said, "O God, master of kings and judges, you who raise up kings and dismiss their power, I perceive with my mind that you made me great among all kings, and that you caused horns to grow on my head, so that I may gore with them the kingdoms of the world. Give me the power from the heavens of your sanctity, so that I may receive strength greater than the kingdoms of the world, and I will humiliate them and glorify your name forever, O Lord." The second reference occurs towards the end of the text as God speaks to Alexander and tells him that he gave him 2 horns to use them as a weapon against otherworldly kingdoms. "I made you great among all kings, and I caused horns of iron to grow on your head, so that you may gore with them the kingdoms of the world." The 2-horned imagery of the Syriac Alexander legend draws together elements from the Peshitta of 1 Kings 22, 2 Chronicles, Micah, and the 2-horned ram in Daniel 8. In particular, the term used in the legend for 2 horns, Qarnayn, is likely to be inspired by the appearance of Qarnayn in the Peshitta, that's the standard Syriac translation of Daniel 8:3. They are lifting their interpretation of Daniel 8:3 for Alexander, not Cyrus the Great, for those who might take the Cyrus hypothesis. By the 7th century of the Common Era, right when Muhammad was receiving his revelations, this Christianized version of Alexander was everywhere in the Near East. The nickname, the 2-horned one, had become synonymous with Alexander. As Dr. Kevin Van Bladel suggests, by this time the connection was automatic, universal, unmistakable. To speak of the 2-horned one in late antiquity was to invoke Alexander the Great. No explanation required, no ambiguity possible. The association would be equivalent to, say, basketball being associated with Michael Jordan, bodybuilding with Arnold Schwarzenegger, golfing with Tiger Woods, baseball with Babe Ruth, boxing with Muhammad Ali, with a list that can go on and on. The Quran's blind inheritance. And here's where we arrive at the devastating implications for Islamic theology. The Quran picks up this already Christianized Alexander legend and presents him as al-Qarnayn, literally the 2-horned one, a righteous ruler chosen by God traveling to the ends of the earth, building a barrier against Gog and Magog, fulfilling an apocalyptic role. But here's what's absolutely devastating. The Quran shows zero awareness of the original context of these horns. There's no acknowledgement that the horns were born as symbols of pagan god-man worship. No explanation of why this hero has two horns. No origin story. The Qur'an just accepts the nickname as if it's always meant what the Christianized version says it means. Just a reminder, the Christians and Jews had divorced the pagan divine meaning from Alexander, and the Qur'an blindly carries this along with the tradition already laid by those before it. Think about what this means. An all-knowing God, dictating his eternal message through the angel Gabriel, uses a nickname for a hero that originates from pagan divine sonship claims, the exact kind of polytheistic idolatry that the Qur'an spends hundreds of verses condemning. The author of the Qur'an inherited this sanitized, Christianized version of the Alexander legend, where the horns had already been stripped of their pagan meaning and repackaged as prophetic symbolism. He didn't know or didn't care that just 900 years earlier, those same horns represented Alexander's claim to be the literal son of Zeus Ammon. Come on, an omniscient deity would know this entire history. He would know that the two horns trace back to Zeus Ammon worship at Siwa. He would know that Jewish and Christian writers had deliberately reinterpreted this pagan symbol for their own purposes. He would surely mention this problematic origin or avoid the nickname entirely. But the Qur'an doesn't show divine omniscience here. It shows exactly what we'd expect from a 7th century human author working with second-hand, already sanitized Christian legends. He uses the nickname everyone in his culture would recognize without understanding its deeper history. So the order of things, Zeus Ammon worship in 331 moves over to Jewish prophetic reinterpretation in the 2nd century BCE, which gets picked up by Josephus as mentioned, Christian apocalyptic transformation in the 4th to 6th century CE, and Islamic adoption in the 7th century of the Common Era. The Qur'an is at the end of a centuries-long game of theological telephone, inheriting a story that had been edited, sanitized, and repackaged multiple times, and it shows no awareness of the original message that started the whole thing. This isn't just one detail. This is a smoking gun that reveals the human fingerprints all over what is claimed to be divine revelation. Let's look at another key element that became particularly important in apocalyptic literature: Alexander's role as the guardian against Gog and Magog. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, 6 whole centuries before Islam, already records the story. Alexander shut up the Scythians, identified with Gog and Magog, behind iron gates, to protect civilization from their destructive hordes. Let that date sink in. 1st century of the Common Era. The story of Alexander builds gates to contain Gog and Magog was already ancient when Muhammad was born. It had been circulating for half a millennium, growing more elaborate with each retelling. But it's not just Jewish legends we need to examine. The smoking gun, the direct source of the Qur'an's version, comes from Syriac Christianity, the Mesopotamian roots, from Gilgamesh to the Qur'an. But before we examine the Syriac smoking gun, we need to go deeper, back to the ultimate source of these legends, because the Alexander romance didn't spring up from nowhere. It was built on foundations that were already ancient when Alexander himself was born. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the original quest for immortality. Uruk, ancient Mesopotamia, circa 2100 BCE. Nearly 4,000 years ago, Mesopotamian scribes were recording what may be humanity's first great epic, the story of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. When his beloved friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is devastated by the realization that he too must die. He becomes obsessed with finding the secret of eternal life, a quest that will take him to the ends of the earth. Gilgamesh travels to the mouth of the rivers, a mystical spot at the world's edge where he hopes to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood who was granted immortality by the gods. To get there, Gilgamesh must overcome nearly impossible obstacles. He ventures through a tunnel of total darkness beneath Mount Mashu for 12 double hours, essentially 12 hours of groping in pitch black, guarded by terrifying scorpion men who warn him not to continue. The ancient tablet records, 1 double hour he travels, yet it is not light. 2 double hours he travels, dense is the darkness. It does not become light. Finally, he emerges into a beautiful garden by the sea, with jewels growing on trees like fruit. At the shore, he meets Siduri, a divine alewife who urges him to abandon his quest. But Gilgamesh insists, and she directs him to a boatman who can ferry him across the waters of death to Utnapishtim's distant home. After sailing for a month and a half across these deadly waters, touch them and you perish. Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, who reveals the secret, a magical plant that can restore youth, growing deep under the sea in the primeval waters of the Apsu. And Gilgamesh actually does it. He heroically dives into the waters and plucks the precious plant. Victory at last! Or so it seems. But stopping to bathe on the journey home, he places the plant of life on the ground. In that instant, a snake slithers up, drawn by the plant's divine scent, and snatches it away. The snake eats the plant and immediately sheds its skin, reborn in youth. The ancient tablet records his lament. A serpent who snuffed the plant's scent darted up from the water and snatched it. He vanished in the twilight, leaving his spoil. Then Gilgamesh wept. For whom have I labored, O Ur-Shanabi? Not for myself have I gained the reward, but for an earth lion only it was secured. The Alexander connection, discovered over a century ago. In 1894, the Assyriologist Bruno Mesnier published Alexander und Gilgamesh, a groundbreaking study that demonstrated the Alexander romance's Water of Life legend was directly inspired by the Epic of Gilgamesh. The parallels are impossible to dismiss. A hero king seeks immortality. Gilgamesh, spurred by Enkidu's death, undertakes a quest to escape death. Alexander similarly quests to find the fountain of eternal life. Journeying to the ends of the earth, Gilgamesh travels to the mouth of the rivers at the world's edge. Alexander travels to the land of darkness and the land of the blessed. Traveling through darkness, Gilgamesh's trek through pitch-black tunnel of Mount Mashu is mirrored by Alexander's march through the sunless land of darkness. Guardian figures and warnings. Gilgamesh is met by scorpion men who try to dissuade him. Alexander is advised by wise old men and ultimately turned back by divine birds. The encircling ocean and deadly waters. Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death with a boatman. Alexander must cross a perilous sea around paradise. The life-renewing gift. For Gilgamesh, it's a plant of youth from the ocean floor. For Alexander, it's a spring of life-giving water hidden in darkness. The stilling creature. Gilgamesh loses his plant to a snake, which then sheds its skin. Alexander loses his water of life moment to a fish, which comes back to life. Mesnier concluded over a century ago, in view of the totality of correspondence, one cannot remain skeptical. The Alexander legend descends directly from the Gilgamesh epic. The Alexander romance didn't just borrow from Gilgamesh. It drew from multiple Mesopotamian sources, proving these ancient stories were well known and actively circulating in the Hellenistic period. In some versions of the Alexander romance, Alexander isn't content with traversing earth and sea. He also ascends to the heavens, One famous legend has Alexander fashioning a flying machine. He harnesses eagles or griffins to a basket and holds out meat on spears so the hungry birds carry him upward into the sky. While airborne, Alexander marvels at the earth below, noting how small everything appears as he ascends. The Greek recension known as version C includes this aerial journey, and even the Talmud mentions Alexander's attempt to ascend to the firmament. The Jerusalem Talmud not only sees the earth as flat, but that the earth is completely surrounded by water, just like typical ancient cosmology. But the most impressive part is this mention of Alexander. Rebbe Yonah said, "When Alexander the Macedonian wanted to ascend, he rose and rose and rose until he saw the earth as a ball and the ocean like a plate." Jerusalem Talmud. In the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Tamid 32a through b, written between the 3rd to 5th century of the Common Era, Alexander the Great becomes a figure through which the rabbis teach moral lessons. They do a spin on the very popular Alexander the Great legends which Christians have popularized. Here's how it goes. First, Alexander consults the elders of the Negev about marching into Africa. They warn him that the mountains of darkness block the way, but Alexander insists. They advise him to take Libyan donkeys, which can walk in pitch blackness, and to carry ropes so he can find his way back. The lesson is clear. Even the greatest king must rely on humble creatures and careful planning to move forward. Next, he comes to a city inhabited entirely by women. He prepares for battle, but the women stop him with sharp reasoning. If he kills them, people will mock him as the king who kills women. If they kill him, he will be remembered as the king whom women destroyed. Instead, he asks for bread. They bring him golden bread on a golden table, mocking his greed. Alexander admits his folly and inscribes on the city gate that he learned wisdom from women. Later, Alexander eats near a spring. As he watches salted fish, he notices a sweet fragrance and realizes the spring flows from the Garden of Eden. He follows it to Eden's gate and cries out to be admitted. But the gatekeepers replied with Psalm 118, verse 20, "This is the gate of the Lord, the righteous shall enter." Alexander insists that as a king he deserves entry, but he is denied. Instead, they give him a single eyeball. He weighs the eyeball against all his gold and silver, but it outweighs everything. Perplexed, he asks the rabbis for an explanation. They tell him it is the human eye, which is never satisfied. Only when he covers it with dust does the scale balance. This symbolizes that human greed ends only in death. As Proverbs 27:20 says, Sheol and Abaddon are never satisfied, so the eyes of man are never satisfied. The section concludes with a teaching, Gehenna, the place of punishment, is either above the heavens or beyond the mountains of darkness, meaning Alexander cannot conquer everything. In these tales, Alexander is not the invincible conqueror of history. The rabbis reimagined him as a man humbled by donkeys, mocked by women, denied entry to Eden, and taught that wealth cannot satisfy the human eye. He conquers the world, but cannot conquer himself. As mentioned before, Alexander ascends to the heavens. This aerial adventure has no parallel in the Gilgamesh epic, but it perfectly matches another Mesopotamian story, the legend of Etanna, a mythical Sumerian king of Kish, who desperately wanted a plant of birth to help his wife conceive a child. To obtain it, Etanna had to fly to heaven to speak with the gods. And how did he fly? He befriended a giant eagle and rode on its back into the sky. As Etanna and the eagle ascended through the clouds, the eagle gave him a bird's-eye view tour of the world. The cuneiform tablets describe how, as they went higher, the earth looked even smaller. After the first double hour of flight, the eagle said, "Look, my friend, how the land appears now. The vast sea is but small waters." After the second, the land looked like a garden, the sea like a tub. This is exactly the kind of perspective commentary later attributed to Alexander in his flying basket, marveling at how the great earth shrinks to nothing from the heavens. The correspondence is so specific, the eagle ride, the comparisons of Earth's appearance from on high, that we're clearly dealing with another borrowed motif. Messner and others concluded that the Alexander writers plugged in the Neṣḥānā legend to supply Alexander's airborne adventure. It's a perfect fit. Alexander's griffin-powered ascent is the Hellenistic remix of Neṣḥānā's eagle ride. And here's what's crucial. Later authors explicitly show awareness that these Mesopotamian tales were circulating and being conflated. The Greco-Roman writer Aelian, 3rd century of the Common Era, even tells a story about Gilgamesh. That is essentially the tale of a baby saved by an eagle, which properly belongs to Neṣḥānā or related legends, not to Gilgamesh. At any rate, an eagle fostered a baby, and I want to tell the whole story. So the guards, from fear of the king, hurled the infant from the citadel, for that was where the girl was imprisoned. Now an eagle, which saw with its piercing eye the child while still falling, before it was dashed to the earth, flew beneath it, flung its back under it, and conveyed it to some garden and set it down with the utmost care. But when the keeper of the palace saw the pretty baby, he fell in love with it and nursed it, and it was called Gilgamesh, and became king of Babylon. Aelian, on Nature of Animals. It seems some ancient storytellers merged these two heroes, confusing or combining their deeds. By the time of Alexander's romance, all these threads, Gilgamesh, Neṣḥānā, folk tales like the hero on the eagle, were part of the world's Near Eastern lore. So Alexander's legend isn't based on one Mesopotamian story. It's an amalgam of at least two, Gilgamesh's quest for immortality and Neṣḥānā's skyward journey for a different kind of life-giving plant. And both of those older tales in turn reflect the ancient human fascination with overcoming our natural limits, be it death with Gilgamesh or gravity with Neṣḥānā. The creators of the Alexander romance ingeniously wove these into Alexander's narrative, as if saying, our hero did all the amazing things of past heroes and more. It's a great example of mythological syncretism, where popular motifs keep getting recycled, transcending their original contexts. What this proves about cultural transmission. This multiple source borrowing proves something crucial. By the Hellenistic period, 3rd century BCE onward, these ancient Mesopotamian legends were widely known, actively circulated, and being combined into new narratives. These weren't forgotten tales locked away in dusty archives. They were living stories that traveled across languages, cultures, and centuries, being adapted, merged, and repackaged for new audiences. Which means that by the 7th century of the Common Era, when the Qur'an was being composed, these legendary traditions, the immortality quest, the heavenly ascent, the divine guidance, were thoroughly embedded in Near Eastern culture. The Christian remix: plant becomes water, snake becomes fish. Even more fascinating, the differences between the stories of Gilgamesh and the Alexander legends reveal deliberate Christian adaptation. By the 3rd to 5th centuries of the Common Era, when the Alexander romance was taking shape, storytellers were living in an increasingly Christianized society. Scholar Dr. Tommaso Tessai has demonstrated that the changes weren't random, they were theological. The plant of life became living water, because in Christian context, water is loaded with meaning. Baptism, spiritual cleansing, the living water Jesus spoke of as eternal life. Gilgamesh's pagan earth herb was replaced by Christ's holy life-giving water that any late antique audience would associate with baptism. The snake became a fish, because snakes carried negative connotations. Eden's serpent, Satan, while fish had become a potent Christian symbol. The Greek word ekthys was used as an acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. Early Christians called new believers little fish, born in baptismal water. As Tessa E. observes about Alexander's legend, the fish resurrecting when washed in water of life implies a strong Christian allegorical dimension in which the theme of baptism as way of salvation is central. A dead fish brought back to life by water? That's a baptismal resurrection allegory. The Gilgamesh story had been Christianized, keeping the narrative skeleton but infusing it with new theological meaning. So that we are clear, Mesopotamian epic 2100 BCE influences Greek Alexander legends 3rd to 5th century of the Common Era. Christian symbolism adaptation that moves into a Syriac Christian version through the 6th to 7th centuries of the Common Era, and then the Islamic inheritance where they strip some of these Christian elements for their own theological purposes. By the time these stories reached the 7th century Arabia, they had been layered, adapted, and repackaged through multiple cultures and theological frameworks. The Qur'an inherited not the original Gilgamesh, but the Christianized Alexander version, which itself was a reworking of an ancient Mesopotamian tale. Even more important, the Alexander legends contain another figure who becomes crucial to Islamic tradition. The mysterious servant or cook who discovers the water of life and allegedly drinks from it, gaining immortality in Alexander's legend. This figure would later be identified in Islamic tradition as Ghadir, the immortal guide who appears in Surah 18 alongside the Moses story. The connection between Alexander's quest for the water of life, the immortal companion, and the Quranic Moses and Ghadir narrative is profound. But that's a story for our next episode in this series. For now, understand this: Surah 18 doesn't just contain one story borrowed from Alexander legends. It contains multiple interconnected narratives, all tracing back to these ancient sources. What this means for divine revelation. Think about what we've just traced. A 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian polytheistic epic about a demigod king seeking immortality was adapted by Greek storytellers into Alexander legends, then Christianized with baptismal symbolism, then transmitted in Syriac to 7th century Arabia, where it was incorporated into what's claimed to be the eternal, uncreated Word of Allah. At no point in this centuries-long journey does the Quran indicate awareness of this complex transmission history. It presents the stories as if they're original revelations, with no acknowledgement that they're reworked legends that have traveled through Mesopotamian, Greek, Jewish, and Christian hands before reaching Islamic scripture. An omniscient deity dictating eternal truth would surely mention, "This is a story humans have been telling for millennia, and here's what it actually means." Instead, the Quran presents these pre-existing legends as if they're new divine information. Exactly what we'd expect from a human author working with the legendary materials available in his cultural environment. Now, armed with this understanding of the deep roots of these legends, let's return to the specific Syriac texts that the Quran copied, the smoking gun that proves literary borrowing beyond any doubt. The Syriac smoking gun. Mid-6th century of the Common Era, 530 to 565, Byzantine Empire. A Syriac Christian author writing in the Aramaic dialect used by Eastern Christians composes what scholars call the Syriac Legend of Alexander, or Neṣḥānā de Alexandros, the victory of Alexander. This isn't just another retelling of the Alexander romance. It's an apocalyptic story written in a time of extremely fierce rivalry between the Byzantine Empire under Justinian I and the Sasanian Persian Empire under Khosrow I. At its heart, the text is political theology. Alexander, reimagined as a pious prophet king, becomes a cipher for the Roman emperor, a defender of Christendom, the one who builds the cosmic gate that restrains Gog and Magog until the ends of time. For over a century, scholars believed they had the Syriac Alexander legend pinned down. The evidence seemed clear. The text contained a prophecy dated to the year 940 of the Seleucid era, 628 to 629 of the Common Era. That just so happened to match the reign of Emperor Heraclius, fresh off his victory over the Persians. Naturally, the conclusion was obvious. The Neṣḥānā de Alexandros was propaganda, a Christian text, glorifying Heraclius as a new Alexander. But then comes the twist. Tommaso Tessai looked closer at the text, line by line, and what he found was strange. The so-called Heraclean prophecy didn't fit. Its vocabulary looked slightly different. Its style broke the flow of the surrounding narrative. Even more suspicious, it was nearly a carbon copy of an earlier prophecy in the same text. This is the smoking gun. The 940 prophecy wasn't original. It was an interpolation, a later addition, inserted to make the story relevant again in the 620s. Think of it like patching an old apocalyptic story to keep it fresh. Strip away the patch, and what's left is a text that belongs not to Heraclius' reign, but to the age of Justinian I, nearly a century earlier. That means the core of the Syriac Alexander legend was composed in the mid-6th century of the Common Era, a whole generation before Muhammad was even born. Dr. Tessai has far more evidence supporting this argument in his book, The Syriac Legend of Alexander's Gate, Apocalypticism at the Crossroads of Byzantium and Iran. And his work has persuaded other brilliant scholars to reconsider the dating of this text. Modern scholarship, especially the work of Kevin Van Bladel and Tommaso Tessai, demonstrates that the Syriac Alexander legend was not only written before Islam, but was also widely transmitted in oral form. Its distinctive details, the fetid sea, the people with no covering from the sun, the wall of iron and copper, Gog and Magog confined until the last day, are exactly the motifs that reappear in the Qur'an story of al-Qarnayn in Qur'an 18:83-102. By the early 7th century, this Christian apocalyptic legend had become part of the cultural atmosphere of late antiquity. The Qur'an preserves it almost intact, showing how deeply intertwined its origins are with the world of Syriac Christianity. Let's examine the evidence. I literally want you to see with your own eyes how impossibly specific these parallels really are. 1. The two horns. Syriac legend. Alexander prays to God, acknowledging that the Lord caused horns to grow on my head so that I might thrust down the kingdoms of the earth. Qur'an 18:83-84. The very name al-Qarnayn means the two-horned one. Historical context: coins and art across the Middle East showed Alexander with ram's horns, a symbol of Zeus Ammon. By late antiquity, the two-horned one automatically meant Alexander. 2. Power from God. Syriac legend. Alexander begs God to grant him heavenly powers so he can subdue kingdoms and glorify God's name. Quran. God says of al-Qarnayn, "We established him in the land and gave him the means of everything." Both texts cast him not as a mere conqueror, but as an agent of divine authority. 3. The murky sea. Syriac legend. Alexander sails until he reaches the fetid sea, Oceanus, at the edge of the world, described as dark, deadly waters. Qur'an 18:86. al-Qarnayn finds the sun setting in a spring of murky, fetid water. The same rare adjective, fetid, murky, appears in Syriac and Arabic, suggesting direct borrowing. 4. Judging wrongdoers. Syriac legend. Alexander sends condemned criminals to the shore of the fetid sea, reasoning it's fitting that those guilty of death should die. Qur'an 18:87. al-Qarnayn declares, "Whoever does wrong, him shall we punish. Then he shall be returned to his Lord." The Qur'an condenses what the Syriac spells out in detail. 5. The rising sun. The Syriac legend, Alexander travels to where the sun rises through the window of heaven. The people there must hide in caves from its scorching rays. Qur'an 1890, al-Qarnayn reaches a people for whom we had provided no covering against the sun. The Syriac version explains the odd Quranic detail. Gog and Magog. Syriac legend, Alexander journeys north to pass between mountains where locals warn of savage tribes, the Huns, whose first kings are named Gog and Magog. Qur'an 1894, the people plead with al-Qarnayn, Gog and Magog cause great corruption in the land. Both texts make Alexander, al-Qarnayn, the warden holding back Gog and Magog until the end of time. Building the barrier, Syriac legend, Alexander orders smiths to construct a massive gate of iron and brass to seal off Gog and Magog. Qur'an 1895-96, al-Qarnayn commands, "Bring me blocks of iron, pour molten brass upon it." The materials and sequence match directly. The end of times, Syriac legend, at the last day, God will destroy Alexander's gate, and Gog and Magog will flood out to ravage the world. Qur'an 1898 and 2196, chapter 21, the barrier will crumble when the Lord's promise arrives, and Gog and Magog will surge like waves until Judgment Day. Both link the collapse of the barrier to the final apocalypse. Modern scholars such as Kevin Van Bladel conclude that the Quran's tale is drawn straight from the Syriac Alexander legend. Every step of the Quranic story, from the murky sea to the rising sun, from Gog and Magog to the iron wall, has its fuller explanation in the Syriac version. The Quran preserves the skeleton, but the Syriac text shows the flesh and blood. The Quran's tale of al-Qarnayn isn't some unique revelation, ladies and gentlemen. It's a rerun. Every beat of the story shows up in the Syriac Alexander legend, only with more detail. Same exact order, same exact events, same quirks. The parallels are so exact, it's laughable to call it coincidence. The Quran is just retelling a Christianized Alexander myth already making the rounds centuries earlier. The apocalyptic panic, when Muslims realized their mistake. Now we arrive at one of the most revealing chapters in our investigation, not about what the Quran says, but about how Muslims have desperately tried to explain it away for the past 2 centuries. Because here's what's fascinating. The identification of al-Qarnayn or Zul-Qarnayn has been a controversial matter from the earliest times. In general, the Muslim commentators have been found of the opinion that he was Alexander the Great, thanks to Dr. Joshua Little for providing 5 powerful authoritative Muslim scholars who attest to this understanding. 1. Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. He died in 767 of the Common Era. One of the earliest Quran commentators in Islamic history. We're talking about a scholar writing just 135 years after Muhammad's death. Stated in his tafsir, 3 individuals ruled over the entire earth, Nimrod ibn Canaan and al-Qarnayn, whose name was Alexander Caesar, then Tuba ibn Abi Shurahil, the Hamorite. This is monumental. Muqatil authored one of the earliest complete commentaries on the Quran. He clearly counts Alexander Caesar, Alexander Caesar, among the great world rulers, calling him by his name as al-Qarnayn. 2. Qatada ibn Di'amah. He died in 735 of the Common Era, via Ibn Abd al-Hakam. Qatada was an early Mufassir, interpreter of the Quran, and hadith transmitter in Basra, essentially a second-generation Islamic scholar, barely a century after Muhammad. Ibn Abd al-Hakam died in 871 of the Common Era. The Egyptian historian and jurist preserved Qatada's blunt words in his Futamsir. Alexander was al-Qarnayn. Let that sink in. A voice from barely 100 years after Muhammad, already equating al-Qarnayn with Alexander the Great. This identification was part of early Islamic historical memory. 3. Ibn Hisham died 833 of the Common Era. The 9th century Abbasid era historian best known for editing the Prophet Muhammad's biography. Arguably, the most important biographical source in early Islam, plainly wrote, his name was Al-Iskandar, Alexander. He was the one who built Alexandria, the name of which traces back to him. Ibn Hisham's authority as the transmitter of Ibn Ishaq's Sirah makes this identification especially notable. He was no fringe writer, but a central figure in early Islamic scholarship. 4. Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, 839 to 923 of the Common Era, the towering giant of Islamic scholarship, described as an impressively prolific polymath of Islam's golden age, widely respected for his historical annals and Quranic exegesis. In his monumental tafsir, al-Tabari records a Yemenite tradition from Wahb ibn Munabi. al-Qarnayn was a man of the Romans. His name was Alexandros. The fact that Tabari chose to preserve this Alexander tradition is powerful evidence of what mainstream Muslims believed in the 9th to 10th centuries. 5. Abu al-Qasim al-Karmani, circa 1100 of the Common Era, an established scholar of Quranic interpretation, Arabic grammar, and jurisprudence in the 11th century. In his Tafsir Gharib al-Tafsir al-Karmani explicitly states, but the bulk al-Jumhur of exegetes hold that he is Iskandar, Alexander. By the medieval period, the identification had become consensus in learned circles. This wasn't fringe speculation. This was mainstream Islamic scholarship. From the 8th century through the 11th century, across 3 centuries of Islamic scholarship, from Basra to Yemen to Persia to Egypt, authoritative Muslim scholars consistently taught that al-Qarnayn was Alexander the Great. They were right in this identification. They weren't guessing in the dark. This was the standard interpretation echoed by historians of the Prophet's era, expert Quran commentators, compilers of Islamic lore, the bulk of medieval exegetes. So if for over 1,000 years this identification was standard, mainstream, uncontroversial, what changed? You see, they knew the Syriac Alexander Legend and related lore, which had already Christianized Alexander into a monotheistic-style king. In those sources, Alexander prays to one God, receives divine help, and builds the Gog and Magog wall as part of an end-times drama. So the problem of his paganism didn't exist for them. They weren't thinking of the historical Alexander, but of the legendary Alexander. But then something happened. Muslim scholars began doing actual historical research, I imagine. They started reading the Syriac Alexander Legend. They traced the pagan origins of the ram's horns. They documented how Alexander claimed to be the son of Zeus Ammon. They proved the Quranic story was borrowed from Christian sources. And suddenly, Muslim apologists had a massive problem on their hands. The cognitive dissonance crisis. Imagine you're a medieval Muslim scholar. You happily identify al-Qarnayn as Alexander because everyone in your culture knows the Alexander legends. The Syriac Christians tell these stories. Jewish communities have versions. Persian poets write epics about Iskandar. It's common cultural knowledge. Then, you learn the uncomfortable truth. The historical Alexander was a Greek pagan polytheist who claimed to be the literal son of Zeus Ammon, wore ram's horns as symbols of his divinity, sacrificed to pagan gods at every temple, declared himself a god and demanded worship. died young, probably drunk, definitely not righteous. And this pagan god-man polytheist is the hero of your holy Qur'an, just praised as a righteous servant of Allah. The cognitive dissonance hits like a freight train. You have two choices. 1. Admit the Qur'an borrowed a pagan legend and didn't know the true history. Or 2. Make something up to protect your sacred text. Many, or most, Muslim apologists choose option 2. And what followed was centuries of increasingly desperate intellectual gymnastics. I'm sure there were other reasons for coming up with different identifications, but to pretend finding out the real history of Alexander didn't play a role, I think it's outright dishonest. Demolishing the apologetic defenses, one by one. Let's systematically dismantle some major apologetic strategies that have been invented to avoid the obvious conclusion. Apologetic Defense 1. There were 2 Alexanders. This is one of the boldest apologetic inventions pushed in works like Mufti Muhammad Shafi's Ma'arif al-Quran. The claim goes like this. There weren't just one, but 2 different Alexanders. The bad one is the Macedonian pagan we all know from history, son of Philip, student of Aristotle, conqueror of Persia. But supposedly there was also another earlier righteous Alexander who lived 2,000 years before Christ, prayed to Allah, met Abraham at the Kaaba, had Khidir as his vizier, and ruled as a faithful monotheist. Reality check, ladies and gentlemen. There is 0 evidence for this. None. No inscription, no coin, no record in Greek, Roman, Persian, Jewish, or Christian sources ever mentions a second Alexander. Every culture that knew him knew one Alexander, the Macedonian conqueror. The Greeks knew Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon. The Persians knew Alexander, the destroyer of Persepolis. The Jews knew Alexander, the Greek king who visited Jerusalem. The Syriac Christians knew Alexander, hero of their apocalyptic legends. The Romans knew Alexander, the king they measured themselves against. Not one culture hints at an earlier holy Alexander. This apologetic is basically like saying, actually, there were 2 Julius Caesars. One, the dictator who crossed the Rubicon, and another, much earlier, righteous Julius Caesar. Yeah, that's right, who lived in Abraham's time, went on pilgrimage to Mecca, and secretly worshipped one God. That's how absurd this sounds. It's a desperate attempt to conjure a second figure out of thin air, simply to protect the Quran from the embarrassment of having its righteous 2-horned one identified with a very pagan Greek king. So the verdict on that is pure fabrication, a theological invention, not history. Apologetic defense number 2. Historical blunders expose the lie. But it gets worse. The Islamic sources promoting the righteous Alexander theory are riddled with historical errors that prove they're working from folklore and not facts. Mufti Muhammad Shafi's claim Alexander was a fire-worshipping polytheist. This is false. Alexander was a Greek polytheist devoted to Zeus, Dionysus, and Egyptian Amun. Fire worship is Zoroastrian. That's the Persians. This error confuses Alexander with the very people he conquered. Alexander's destruction of Zoroastrian temples suggests hostility or conquest of that religion, not conversion to it or worship of its fires. Historically, his actions make sense of the view that he was promoting his own religious political identity and eliminating rivals like Zoroastrianism. Mufti's claim? The Roman calendar begins with Alexander. That's incorrect. The Roman calendar dates from 753 BCE, 4 centuries before Alexander was born. This is laughably false. Any classicist of the Roman world would spit their drink out at such a claim. Another one of Mufti's claim. Aristotle was Alexander's minister. In reality, Aristotle was Alexander's childhood tutor in Macedonia. He never served as a vizier or minister in Alexander's empire. This confusion comes from legendary embellishments in the romance much later, not history. Muftis claim Alexander killed Darius. Nope. Darius III was betrayed and murdered by Bessus, one of his own satraps. Alexander actually gave Darius a royal burial. Getting this basic fact wrong shows total historical ignorance. Not to say Alexander wouldn't have killed him, but he factually didn't do it. These aren't minor mistakes. These are fundamental errors that prove the Islamic sources are repeating folklore and legend, not historical facts. Modern apologists are just repeating them today. Apologetic Defense 3. Fabricated genealogies. Ibn Kathir, cited approvingly by modern apologists, preserves a genealogy tracing Alexander back through Rome, Greece, and all the way to Isaac, son of Abraham. You got that right. Here's the genealogy Ibn Kathir, quoting Ibn Asakir, gives, broken down into plain English so it's easy to follow. Technically, Alexander the Great, the Macedonian son of Philip, is said to be the second al-Qarnayn. His ancestry is traced backward through a long list of semi-legendary names. Ibn Kathir reports it as Alexander Iskander, son of Philip, son of Mudrin, son of Hermes, son of Hardis, son of Mitan, son of Rumi, son of Lanti, son of Yunan, Greek Ion, son of Japheth, one of Noah's sons, son of Nuna, son of Sarham, son of Ruma, son of Tharnat, son of Tafil, son of Rumi, son of Al-Asfar, son of Eliphaz, son of Esau, son of Isaac, Ishak, son of Abraham, Ibrahim al-Khalil. So basically, this genealogy tries to graft Alexander directly into the biblical family trees, making him a descendant of Esau, Isaac, and Abraham. In simple terms, Ibn Kathir is saying Alexander wasn't just a Greek king, but part of the Abrahamic line, related to the patriarchs of Judaism and Islam. It's a classic example of Islamic legend making where historical figures are adopted into a biblical genealogy to make them fit the Qur'an's framework. Historically, of course, Alexander was Macedonian, the son of Philip II, and not related to Abraham at all. And we know Alexander's lineage. He was from the Argead dynasty of Macedon. This genealogy is pure fabrication, a retroactive insertion designed to make a Greek pagan king seem connected to biblical history. Similarly, stories that Alexander performed Hajj with Abraham or that Khidir was his vizier are late embellishments, looking backwards, forcing Alexander into a biblical framework he never belonged to. Apologetic Defense 4. The Cyrus Substitution. Maybe al-Qarnayn wasn't Alexander at all. Maybe it was Cyrus the Great of Persia all along, says Muslim apologist. The logic. Cyrus was praised in the Bible, Isaiah 45, as God's anointed and liberator of the Jews. He was a relatively righteous ruler. Surely he's a better fit than pagan Alexander. Problem number 1, Cyrus was never depicted with horns in any ancient source. The two-horned epithet obviously belongs to Alexander. Get me all those Cyrus sources or ancient depictions with him wearing two horns. Problem 2, Cyrus built no iron wall against Gog and Magog. That entire legend is tied to Alexander, not Cyrus. Problem 3, the Syriac Alexander Legend, the specific text that supplies the Qur'an story, is about Alexander, not Cyrus. Problem 4. For 1,000 plus years, Muslim scholars broadly identified this figure as Alexander, but they and others also entertained qualifications, alternate opinions, or recognized theological difficulties. The Cyrus hypothesis has become more popular in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in Muslim revivalist and apologetic context. Even Maududi himself had to admit, historical facts are not sufficient to make any categorical assertion about Cyrus. Translation: We have no evidence, but we prefer this theory anyway. Apologetic defense number 5, dismissing the real sources as Israelite. A common apologetic strategy is to wave away the Jewish, Christian, and historical sources as unreliable Israelite, Jewish stories that shouldn't be trusted. But here's the devastating irony. Those Jewish and Christian stories are precisely the sources the Qur'an drew from. The motifs in Surah 18 don't line up with Cyrus, or with some unknown Yemeni king, or with any mysterious lost prophet. They line up perfectly with the Alexander romance, a legendary cycle that had been translated into Syriac and adapted by Jewish and Christian writers centuries before Islam. Alexander journeys to the ends of the earth where the sun sets in a muddy spring. He builds a gate of iron and brass against Gog and Magog. He seeks the water of life, accompanied by a servant who discovers it when a fish comes back to life. These are not Quranic innovations. They are direct borrowings from the romance itself, indebted to earlier Mesopotamian epics like Gilgamesh and Neṣḥānā. So let's be clear. You can't dismiss the Jewish and Christian sources as unreliable while simultaneously claiming the Quran's version is original or correct, when the Quran is clearly using those same sources. This is honestly wild. I hear Muslims constantly claim they have the real version of scriptures. When you ask for evidence of these earlier, more accurate sources, they don't show any evidence and don't see the problem. It's ludicrous. Apologetic defense number 6. The Jews were satisfied. Another rhetorical move claims that when the Jews posed the question about al-Qarnayn to Muhammad, his answer satisfied them, proving it was correct. Problem? No evidence is given for this claim. It's merely asserted to close off inquiry. In reality, Jewish traditions about Alexander were complex, often satirical or moralizing, sometimes even critical. We even read one earlier from the Talmud, remember when I read it, with a negative view of Alexander. The idea that the rabbis would be satisfied with the retelling that matched their own legends is circular reasoning. For all we know, they could have been laughing at this so-called prophet for reciting a Christian legend of a recycled pagan polytheistic king. All we have are the Muslim sources saying, "Trust me, bro," and apologists trust the hell out of it. How do I know the story of Jews asking the 3 questions isn't legend itself? Just saying, guys. Apologetic defense number 7. Inventing new identities. When Alexander became problematic and Cyrus didn't work, apologists started throwing out random alternatives. Maybe it was an ancient Yemeni king. No evidence. Maybe it was a Himyarite ruler. Doesn't fit the details. Maybe it's just symbolic. Then why the specific details? Each new theory gets proposed, debunked, and replaced with another equally baseless speculation. Notice the pattern of modern apologists? The goal isn't to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The goal is to find any alternative to the obvious conclusion that the Quran borrowed from pagan Alexander legends. You see, one of the most fascinating and frustrating features of religious text is what happens when they leave the door wide open. The Quran introduces al-Qarnayn, the 2-horned one in Surah 18, but it never tells us who he actually was. No name, no genealogy, just fragments of a legendary journey. And what happens when human beings encounter a mystery in a sacred book? They can't leave it alone. They fill in the blanks. Muslim commentators across the centuries did exactly this. Most said he was Alexander the Great, and they were spot on. Others insisted he was Cyrus of Persia. Some made him a prophet, others a messenger, others a righteous king, and a few even imagined him as a supernatural being with angelic qualities. To explain his horns, traditions sprang up: copper horns, 2 braids of hair, 2 realms of rule, even being struck twice on the head and resurrected. None of these explanations are in the Quran. They're human inventions trying to patch the silence. You literally have to go outside of the Qur'an to find out who he was. The Syriac Alexander Legend is the key. Let's step back and look at what the actual evidence shows outside the apologetic circle. We have Gilgamesh, 2100 BCE, quest for immortality, plant stolen by serpent, journey through darkness. Etana, eagle carries king heavenward, earth shrinks below. Alexander, romance, 3rd to 5th century of the Common Era. Two-horned king, iron gates against Gog and Magog, life-giving spring, servant reviving fish, journeys to sunset and sunrise. Syriac Legend, 530 to 565 of the Common Era, Christian adaptation of Alexander with apocalyptic themes. Quran 18, al-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, travels to the ends of the earth, builds barrier. This is a literary chain. Mesopotamian epic, Hellenistic legend, Jewish Christian adaptation, Syriac Alexander lore, Quran. Every apologetic maneuver, from two Alexanders to Cyrus, from fabricated genealogies to miracle pilgrimages, is transparent once you set it against the actual historical record. What the evidence actually proves. Let's be absolutely clear about what we've established. 1. The Alexander legend predates Islam by centuries. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, mentions Alexander the Great shut up the iron gates from the nation of the Alans, also known as Scythian tribe. Jewish Wars, Book 7, Chapter 7.4. He also relates a known Jewish legend of Alexander the Great visiting Jerusalem and conveys that he owes everything to the God of the Jews. Jewish Antiquities, you see the source. Multiple versions of the legend existed in Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Persian before the 7th century. This was a well-known story throughout the Near East. 2. The Quranic version matches the Syriac version with impossible specificity. Not just general themes, exact details. The two-horned epithet, the journey to sunset, sunrise, the iron and brass wall, the Gog and Magog connection, the end times prophecy. These are literary fingerprints. Dr. Tommaso Tessai has made a solid case. 3. Early Muslims recognized it as Alexander. For over a millennium, many Muslim scholars, I'd say most, identified al-Qarnayn as Alexander. 4. Every alternative explanation fails. Cyrus has no connection to the story elements, its historical claim contradicts archaeology, and the text's mythical geography. The parable defense contradicts the text's own framing. Dr. Kevin Van Bladel summarizes, the Quranic version retells the story, reflecting the interest of Muhammad's community, removing pro-Byzantine components from the Syriac source. Dr. Tommaso Tessai calls it the only case of a Quranic passage traceable to a specific contemporary source. The scholarly consensus is overwhelming. The historical evidence is conclusive. The Quran's story of al-Qarnayn is a retelling of the Syriac Alexander legend. We've traced the journey, a Macedonian conqueror turned Christian allegory, finally recast in the Quran as al-Qarnayn. And the evidence is overwhelming. This isn't divine dictation. It's the Alexander romance dressed in Islamic garb. For centuries, Muslims themselves openly identified him as Alexander. Only later, when history reminded us Alexander was a pagan son of Zeus Ammon, did the panic set in. Suddenly there were two Alexanders, or maybe Cyrus, or some forgotten Yemeni king. Anything but the obvious. That's not revelation. That's called frickin' scrambling. The illiteracy defense. It collapses. These stories were oral, retold across the markets of Arabia. The Quran itself admits Jews and Christians were asking Muhammad about them. Unless the next apologetic move is that the prophet was deaf and blind, the excuse won't hold. And this isn't an isolated slip. The seven sleepers, Jewish midrash, apocryphal gospels, Zoroastrian legends, they all found their way into the Quran. It isn't the voice of a god breaking into history, but the voice of 7th century Arabia remixing the folklore of its time. Here's the tragedy. Desperate apologetics strip the Qur'an of its real significance. As a human text, it's fascinating. Muhammad took the stories around him, reshaped them, and gave them new meaning for his community. That's impressive. But pretending it dropped untouched from heaven demands terrible history and intellectual gymnastics. The wall of Gog and Magog was never real. The only wall is the one between believers and historical truth. Tear it down, and the Qur'an becomes what it truly is. Not the perfect word of God, but part of humanity's eternal struggle to wrestle meaning out of chaos. The story of al-Qarnayn is beautiful, not because Gabriel whispered it in a cave, but because humans told it and retold it, reshaping it across cultures and centuries. That's the real miracle. Not divine dictation, but human creativity. The legend has been traced, the evidence is clear, and the gates are open. What you do with that knowledge, that's your choice. Oh, and before I close the door on this episode, if someone tries to die on the hill that the Qur'an didn't borrow from the Syriac Alexander Legend, the fact that this legend was so viral all over the world prior to the Qur'an, the elements that overlap in this assessment leave the conclusion undeniable that this is riffing off the same genre in legend. Also, the direction of influence would have clearly been from the more dominant cultures or empires of the day into Arabia and not the other way around. I ask everyone watching to please take the time to subscribe and check that bell so you get notified every time we release a new video. Consider helping us produce these videos by joining the Patreon. Links are in the description below. Our next episode will deal with Moses and Qadir. We plan to do an entire series on the human origins of the Qur'an. Stay tuned and never forget, we are MythVision.